I never believed in ghosts. Superstitions and whispered legends meant nothing to me until the night I stepped into the ruins of the abandoned temple deep within the jungle. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than an exploration, a fleeting curiosity fueled by the stories I had heard from the villagers. They spoke of a temple cursed by the souls of those who had perished within its walls, but I dismissed their fears as mere folklore. Now, standing before its massive, vine-covered entrance, I felt an unease creeping into my bones, cold and unfamiliar. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Towering trees loomed overhead, their branches entwined like skeletal fingers, casting twisted shadows beneath the silver glow of the full moon. The temple itself was a crumbling relic, its once grand stone pillars now cracked and overgrown with moss. Strange carvings lined the entrance, faded and eroded with time, but the eerie expressions remained hauntingly intact. Figures with hollow eyes and twisted grins seemed to stare at me from the stone, as if they knew I had come. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The air changed immediately, growing heavier, pressing against my chest like unseen hands. My flashlight flickered as if resisting the darkness, casting fleeting beams over the temple's vast, empty halls. Dust particles swirled in the dim light, and with each step, the silence deepened. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was listening. The temple had long been abandoned, but it did not feel unoccupied. I could sense something watching me, just beyond my line of sight. The carvings on the walls, depicting scenes of rituals and offerings, seemed to shift in the wavering light. I paused, my pulse was hammering in my ears. The villagers had warned me never to enter after nightfall, saying the spirits awoke when the sun vanished. I had laughed then. Now I wasn't so sure. A faint sound echoed through the vast chamber, a whisper barely audible. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the dark recesses of the temple stretching endlessly before me. The pillars cast long skeletal shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The air grew colder, and with it, an unmistakable feeling settled over me. I wasn't alone. Then a soft chime rang out from deeper within the temple. A bell, but that was impossible. There were no monks here, no priests left to tend to these ruins. The sound was distant, almost dreamlike, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced through every logical explanation, but none of them made sense. My fingers tightened around my flashlight as I stepped forward, drawn toward the sound, despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back. As I moved deeper, the walls seemed to close in, the passage narrowing unnaturally. The flickering light illuminated faded murals, their pigments barely visible under layers of grime. They depicted something unsettling. Figures kneeling before a towering deity, their faces contorted in terror. Some of the figures were bound, others reaching upward as if pleading. But what disturbed me most was the expression of the deity itself. Unlike the benevolent gods depicted in other temples, this one bore a face twisted in an eternal, sinister grin. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the corridor, though there were no windows, no openings for air to pass through. The whispering grew louder, threading through the air like unseen voices, conversing in a language I could not understand. I stopped, my breath hitching. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. The temple felt alive. The walls, the pillars, even the floor beneath my feet pulsed with something ancient, something restless. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move forward. This was just my imagination, I told myself, the result of too many ghost stories, too much time spent in the dark. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just a glimpse, standing at the far end of the chamber, cloaked in shadows, unmoving, watching. I turned my flashlight toward it, but in the split second, the beam reached the spot. The figure was gone. And then, the temple doors slammed shut behind me. The sound of the temple doors slamming shut sent a sharp jolt of panic through me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. But there was nothing. Just the gaping darkness beyond the entrance. My heart pounded as I stepped toward the doors, pressing my palms against the cold, ancient stone. I pushed. They didn't budge. It was as if some unseen force had sealed them shut. A deep breath. I needed to stay calm. There had to be another way out. I turned back toward the main hall, my flashlight beam sweeping over the towering pillars and shadowed alcoves. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. But the temple no longer felt empty. It was watching, waiting. A soft shuffling sound came from the corridor ahead. My stomach twisted. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps on stone. Slow, measured, not mine. I swallowed hard and aimed my flashlight toward the corridor. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust hanging in the air. Nothing moved. But the sound continued. Closer, closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I clenched my jaw, forcing my breath to steady. This was nothing. Just my imagination. Maybe an animal had wandered in. Maybe a whisper right behind me. A chill shot up my spine as every muscle in my body locked. The voice was low, breathy, but the words were unintelligible. I spun around, my flashlight jerking wildly across the walls. The carvings seemed to twist in the shifting light. Their stone faces stretched into something almost grinning. My skin crawled. A sudden gust of icy air swept past me, though there were no openings for wind to enter. I staggered back, my breath visible in the unnatural cold. Then, from the depths of the corridor, the bell rang again. Louder this time. Closer. I took an uneasy step forward, drawn toward the sound despite the terror clawing at my chest. The corridor was narrow, the walls lined with crumbling statues, their hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. I moved slowly, the crunch of dust beneath my boots the only sound. My flashlight flickered. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, something shifted. A figure, no taller than me, draped in tattered robes, stood motionless at the end of the passage. I froze. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me, cold and unwavering. I took a step back. It took a step forward. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on me like invisible hands. The temple walls seemed to close in, the darkness swelling like a living thing. My fingers fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, desperate for another source of light, something more real than the unreliable flicker of my flashlight. The moment the flame sparked to life, the figure was gone. A sharp, ragged breath tore from my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to get out. Now. But just as I turned, something grabbed my wrist. Cold, brittle, not human. I yanked my arm away, stumbling backward. My flashlight flickered wildly, its beam swinging across the corridor. There was nothing there, but my wrist burned with an icy sting, as if fingers of frost had gripped me. My skin was pale, almost bluish, as though drained of warmth. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the chamber. Not one voice, many. Then, the statues along the walls shifted. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. But no, the stone figures were turning, ever so slightly, their heads tilting in my direction. My stomach twisted. Their hollow eyes, once blank, were now filled with something dark and pulsing, like ink swirling in water. I stepped backward, my breath hitching. The laugh grew louder, merging with a chorus of whispers that wrapped around me like a noose. The carvings on the walls, the statues, the very stones beneath my feet, they were alive, pulsing with something ancient and furious. Then, from the darkness ahead, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't whispering. It was calling my name. And it was coming closer. The voice calling my name sent an icy wave of dread through my body. It wasn't the voice of anyone I knew. It was something else. Something ancient. Something wrong. It echoed through the temple, crawling under my skin, like 1,000 unseen fingers pressing against me. I didn't respond. I didn't dare. Instead, I tightened my grip on the flashlight, forcing myself to move forward. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, the darkness swallowing everything beyond my narrow beam of light. But I could feel it. Something shifting in the shadows, watching, waiting. The bell rang again. This time, it was deafening. The vibrations ran through the stone walls, through my bones, through my very mind. It was no longer distant. It was right here. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My fingers brushed against the cold walls for balance, but the moment I touched the carved surface, a sharp pain shot through my palm. I yanked my hand back, my flashlight trembling as I shone it over the wall. The carvings, they had changed. The figures that once knelt in prayer were now writhing in agony. Their stone faces were frozen in silent screams, their hands clawing at the air, at themselves. And then I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. At the center of the mural stood a figure larger than the rest. Unlike the others, its face was not twisted in fear, but in something worse. Satisfaction. A name suddenly surfaced in my mind, unbidden, as if whispered directly into my ear. The Devourer of Lost Souls. My throat tightened. I had never heard of it before, but somehow, I knew. I understood. The temple wasn't just a ruin. It was a prison, a tomb, a place where lost souls were lured and consumed, their pain feeding whatever dark force still lingered here. And now, it had found me. A gust of wind howled through the corridor, but it wasn't natural. It carried voices, whispers of suffering, of pleading, of those who had come before me and never left. I turned, my flashlight barely cutting through the swirling dust and darkness. Then I saw them. Figures half-formed, drifting in and out of the shadows. Some crawled along the walls, their hands leaving behind dark, smeared stains. Others stood in the distance, their hollow eyes locked onto me. One stepped forward. It was a woman, or what was left of her. Her body flickered like a dying flame, her face sunken, her mouth moving soundlessly, but I could hear her. Not through my ears, but in my head. Leave, before it takes you too. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. She reached out a skeletal hand, her fingers hovering just inches from my face. Then, a shadow surged from behind her, wrapping around her like an ink-black tide. She screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was raw, guttural, filled with unbearable agony. She was pulled backward, vanishing into the darkness, her form twisting violently before disappearing completely. The air turned ice cold. A low growl rumbled through the temple, vibrating through the very stones beneath my feet. The carvings on the walls began to crack, pieces of stone crumbling away as the shadows deepened. Then I felt it. A presence behind me. Not a ghost, not a lost soul. Something worse. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My entire body locked up, every nerve screaming at me to run. But I knew that if I moved, if I so much as breathed too loudly, it would take me. A slow, shuddering breath brushed against my neck. The voice was no longer distant. It was right there. You should not have come. I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran, my flashlight swinging wildly, casting chaotic beams of light over the temple walls. The whispers turned to wails, the stone beneath my feet cracking with every frantic step. The air thickened, as if invisible hands were trying to drag me down, pull me under. I turned a corner and froze. The bell. It stood in the center of a massive chamber, covered in thick chains, its surface etched with symbols I couldn't understand. But I knew one thing. It was the source. The temple had been built around it, not to honor it, but to contain it. The ground beneath me trembled as a dark mass began to rise from the shadows, towering over me, its form shifting, writhing, made of endless twisting bodies. Countless hands reached outward, countless faces emerging and disappearing within its depths. The devourer. It opened its mouth, if it even had one, a void, a hunger so deep it pulled at the very air around it. I did the only thing I could. I lunged for the bell. With every ounce of strength left in me, I tore at the chains, my fingers bleeding as I ripped them free. The moment the last chain fell away, the bell moved, and then it rang. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard. Not metallic, not earthly, something else. The devourer shrieked, the temple shook, the darkness recoiled, writhing violently as cracks splintered across the chamber. The shadows screamed as the bell continued to ring, its vibrations tearing through the air like a cleansing fire. The wailing intensified, the figures in the walls clawing at themselves, at each other. The devourer twisted and thrashed, its massive form unraveling, its countless souls breaking free. Then with one final ear-splitting cry, it was gone. The temple fell silent, the darkness lifted. The doors behind me creaked open, moonlight spilling inside. The air was lighter. The weight of something ancient finally lifted. I stumbled out, my legs barely able to carry me. The cool night air filled my lungs, but the scent of decay still lingered. As I turned back one last time, I saw them, the lost souls. They stood in the temple's entrance, their forms flickering like dying embers. But their expressions were no longer twisted in agony. They were free. One by one, they faded into the night. And then I was alone. I never spoke of what happened that night. No one would have believed me. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I swear I can still hear it. The bell, ringing softly in the distance. I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare had ended when the devourer was banished, when the temple stood silent, bathed in moonlight. But I was wrong. As I staggered away from the temple, every nerve in my body still tingling from the terror I had just survived, I felt a strange weight settle over me. It wasn't relief. It was something else. Something worse. The night was too quiet. The jungle, which had once been alive with the sounds of insects and rustling leaves, was now deathly still. Even the wind had stopped. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. I kept walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. My body was weak, but my mind was even weaker. The whispers hadn't left me. They clung to me, crawling beneath my skin like a disease. Then I saw them, shadows, dozens of them, lurking between the trees, moving when I wasn't looking. They weren't the lost souls I had freed. These were different, darker, hungrier. I picked up my pace. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was still trapped in the horror of what had happened. But then, the whisper came again. You carry the mark. I stopped. The mark? I turned my shaking hands over in the moonlight, searching for anything, any sign of what they meant. That's when I saw it. A symbol burned into the skin of my palm. The same symbol I had seen on the temple walls, on the bell, on the chains that once held the devourer. A cold realization settled over me. I hadn't escaped. I had brought something with me. A rustling sound snapped my head up. The shadows were closer now. I could see their forms, elongated, twisted, shifting unnaturally in the darkness. They had no eyes, but I knew they were staring at me, watching, waiting. Then one of them stepped forward. It was the woman, the spirit who had warned me in the temple. But she was different now. Dark veins crawled across her translucent skin, her face hollow, her mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. You freed them, she whispered, her voice echoing from all around me. But something always takes their place. My breath hitched. No, that wasn't possible. The temple was sealed. The devourer was gone. The souls were free. Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. A bell. But it wasn't distant. It was inside me. I dropped to my knees as a wave of nausea crashed over me. My vision blurred, my head pounding, as if something was clawing its way out from within. The shadows around me closed in, circling like vultures over a dying animal. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body convulsed. My veins burned, my skin tightening, my lungs gasping for air that wouldn't come. I felt them, hands, hundreds of them, pressing against me, pulling, dragging me somewhere I couldn't see. Then the whisper returned. This time, it wasn't outside me. It was inside my head. A temple must always have a guardian. I understood then. I hadn't broken the curse. I had become part of it. The last thing I saw, before the darkness swallowed me whole, was the jungle vanishing around me. The temple's doors standing wide open once more. And then, nothing. The next morning, a group of explorers found the temple. They spoke of eerie whispers in the wind, of strange symbols appearing and disappearing on the walls, and of a new carving at the temple's entrance. A figure, frozen in stone, face twisted in silent terror, holding a bell, ringing forever.